Ever heard of the DIABOLI Forest? It's in Clinton County, New York. You can find it a little bit north of Plattsburgh, though I wouldn't recommend it. Clayton and I found it last year. We had just finished college and had yet to find jobs, so we left with the last of our money to explore. Maybe that sounds stupid, but you have to admit a part of you is jealous of the excitement. I think everybody has that feeling at some point, and if they don't act on it, it comes back to haunt them. For Clayton and I, the excitement and the haunting would be one and the same. It started with a conversation at a downtown cafe in Plattsburgh. Local baristas tend to know their regulars. We always chatted them up wherever we went in case they recalled one of those regulars talking about any open positions. While discussing the general area, the barista asked, "Has anyone told you to stay away from the forest?" "No, what's up with the forest?" Clayton asked. Of course, another customer walked in right at that moment. After taking her order, the barista said to us, quieter than before, "DIABOLI Forest. It's up north of here a little, and it's private property owned by the Catholic Church. They pay to have it patrolled and don't let anybody in there." "Why?" I asked. The barista turned his hands up. "There are rumors. I'm sure you can guess their nature. Some tactical weirdo flew a drone over it once thinking he was going to rescue some hidden pregnant women or something. He didn't find anything out there though, and they had him arrested when he posted his footage on Facebook." I asked, "Is the video still up? I want to see it." "It's hard to find," he said, "but I have a screenshot." He showed us a grainy aerial shot of sparse trees with unnatural kinks along their trunks. "What's wrong with the trees?" Clayton asked. The barista said, "I don't know, but they look cool. Not all the trees look like this. This is a specific patch somewhere in there. I'd pay a lot for a better pic than this. They're so creepy looking." "How much would you pay?" I asked, even though I knew he was being hyperbolic. "Psh, I only have $20. Barista, you know." "Okay, how about $20 then? And I see you do paninis, so 2 of those when we get back." A doubtful smirk wrinkled his cheek. He said, "Deal, but don't you dare mention me if you get caught." I know $20 doesn't sound like much, but Clayton and I were running out of money, and we didn't have anything better to do that afternoon. Clayton didn't need any convincing either. Getting arrested would just mean a night or 2 of free lodging. "Hey, check it out," Clayton said just after we walked out of the cafe. He held up a dripping black casing. "What is it?" I asked. "Lipstick," he said, popping it open. "Purple. We can use it to mark our trail in the woods." "Hope those trees aren't that deep," I replied. We drove a few short miles to a gas station outside of town where we left the car. The barista had given us directions for where to walk from there. The church spared no expense on signage warning about trespassing. The fence surrounding the forest only reached my chest, though. If you could see those sinister woods, you might understand how the church could think a bigger fence unnecessary. To call the forest intimidating would vastly understate its ambient evil. The trunks of the trees, as far as we could see, were black. What few leaves managed to grow were small and underdeveloped. Most hung limply as if they'd already given up on living. With no security in sight, Clayton and I jumped the fence. We kept quiet at first. We just kept looking at each other. Besides the occasional flutter of leaves or branches clicking together in the breeze, the forest made no sound. No birds or scurrying animals, not even any insects were anywhere to be seen. "What do you think happened here?" Clayton asked. "Think the government, tested a chemical weapon or something? I mean, what's with these black trees?" He marked one of said trees with his purple lipstick. "Hope not," I said. "Or if they did, I hope it's worn off. What would the Catholics want with it, though?" Clayton said, Your guess is as good as mine, but I hope those bendy trees are close because I don't want to be in here too long. I said, Me either. And another voice mockingly repeated, Me either. I stopped and posed to sprint back the way we'd come, but I noticed Clayton did not react at all. I asked, Did you hear that? Now Clayton stopped to listen, but he shook his head no. Somebody said, Me either. Yeah, you, said Clayton. No, there was... Never mind. I decided I must have heard my own echo and carried on. Clayton marked every few trees with a purple streak. After a while wandering aimlessly, I told Clayton if we couldn't find the barista's weird trees in 20 minutes, we should turn back. I feared we might have to buy our own paninis. A wren landed on a branch a few trees ahead. How much that little bird momentarily comforted Clayton and I should inform you of the desolation surrounding us. It watched us as we passed beneath it. A few steps later, we both heard a truncated squawk and spun around. 2 brown feathers drifted to the ground. The wren was nowhere in sight. Neither were any hawks or owls or anything else that might have snatched the poor bird away. After only taking a few more steps, something zipped right between us, narrowly missing both of our heads. It struck a tree up ahead and left a red blotch under a cloud of brown feathers. The mangled wren lay still at the base of the trunk. We stopped and listened. I whispered, Okay, we should go back right now. That way? Clayton asked, pointing in the direction the bird had just been thrown from. We can circle around, I suggested. Keep marking trees so we can double back if we get lost. A few minutes later, we came to a muddy stream bed filled with tiny bones. There must have been thousands of them belonging to birds, squirrels, mice, stray cats, and who knows what else. Something had been dumping carcasses there for a long time. Speaking low, Clayton said, I'm not walking through that. Let's follow it for a bit and see if it gets narrower. I agreed, having no desire to wade through the river of bones. By some miracle or misfortune, depending on how you look at it, we found the barista's weird trees shortly thereafter. They looked even stranger from ground level. Their trunks all started out straight at the bottom for maybe 2 or in some cases 3 feet, but each one of them bent at a nearly perfect right angle somewhere within that range. Then, every couple of feet, the trunks bent at other angles, repeating all the way to the top. The stream bed ran straight through them, still riddled with bones. Take the pick and let's run, Clayton said. Our frazzled nerves could not have withstood much longer in the forest, perhaps being hunted by some invisible thing. I pulled out my phone and readied my camera. I had to back up, and in doing so, made a curious discovery. I noticed a few of the trunks come into alignment with one another. No way, I mumbled, stepping to the right. Clayton followed me, curious. He gasped when he saw what I saw. From the correct perspective, the trunks aligned in a long channel, a clear path traveling dozens of feet in one direction. The bone river cut directly between them. The bent trees created an illusion of a tunnel that grew narrower the further it went. Both the trees and stream bed ended at a pile of boulders. Surely the entire display must have been man-made, but how or why, I could not guess. I raised my phone to take another picture, wondering if the barista might toss in one of the brownies in the cafe's display case for the added bonus. The moment I snapped the first photo, an audible gurgling came from the boulders. Clayton and I watched, nervous but insatiably curious. From a small gap where 3 boulders met, a bubble burst. Then came the flood. Clayton tugged on my shirt as gallons of tar-like substance erupted from the boulders. It gushed from the gap and sprayed out of smaller crevices, but mostly it oozed into the stream bed and crawled over the bones toward us. "Look, look!" Clayton shouted. He had a good head start on me. When I caught up, he pointed across the still empty portion of stream bed in front of him. "Do you see through the trees? Am I crazy or is that the fence?" He was right. We had apparently chosen a poor entrance point because there a section of fence stood roughly 500 feet from the weird trees we'd come looking for. To reach it, though, we would have to cross the bed. "How are we gonna—" I started. Clayton pointed back up the stream at the slow-moving ooze. "We either cross now or we have to go all the way back, and we still don't know what might be back there." "All right," I said. "Let's do it." We slid down the muddy bank and clattered at the bottom amongst the tiny skeletons there. The ground tried to swallow our feet. I thought I would be lucky to leave with both shoes, and the suction only grew stronger as we neared the middle of the bed. Only the bones provided anything solid to walk on. They snapped and cracked beneath us with each sucking step. "It's coming, Devon," Clayton warned. I looked up. The black ooze was rounding a bend just upstream from us, and we had barely made it halfway across. "Give me your hand," I said. We worked together, taking turns pulling and being pulled. It increased our pace only a little, and within the minute we knew we would be caught. "Hold on," Clayton excitedly gasped as he took a step near the opposite bank. "It's firming up over here. Hurry!" I barely made it. Clayton hoisted me up the opposite bank as the ooze rolled beneath me, filling the holes my feet left behind. Taking no time to revel in our narrow escape, we sprinted to the fence. "Hurry up, Dev, they're coming," Clayton hissed when I was halfway over the fence. I glanced up. A white truck was kicking up dust in the far distance, speeding toward us. They must have seen us on a camera and sent someone out. We laid in some tall grass until the truck passed by, then waited until the sounds of its engine faded before running to our car. "I can't believe you guys did that so fast," the barista said when we returned. The cafe was empty besides us and a high school-aged girl at the cash register. I replied, "We're hungry." "Still?" Clayton asked. He looked ill. I said, "Okay, I guess I'm hungry." The barista replied, "All right, have a seat. My shift just ended, but I'll whip up some paninis." "Do you know anything about what's going on in that forest?" Clayton asked. The barista shook his head and walked behind the counter. When he returned with 2 paninis, no brownies unfortunately, we showed him our pictures. He reacted to them with pure excitement, but Clayton looked away the whole time. Seeing those images made me feel a little sick too. The adrenaline rush of hiding from the security truck overrode the disgust and terror of our experience in the woods, but that adrenaline had long begun to fade. I shared the pictures with the barista, and he gave each of us a $10 bill. He left, telling us to stay until close if we wanted. But no more free food, he admonished both us and his replacement. A family with 2 little girls entered and sat in the booth behind Clayton. One of the girls, probably no more than 3 years old, looked over the booth and smiled bashfully when our eyes met. I smiled back and stuck out my tongue, just being silly. She giggled, then disappeared. Minutes later, both girls' heads popped over the barrier. Their mother scolded them, and although they sat back down at first, it didn't take them long to steal another peek at the silly face guy. This time, they both made faces at me. Their dad caught me returning the favor. I gave him a friendly wave, and he gave me a watchful nod. I would have been content if the girls just stayed down for the rest of our meal. but they did not. The girls prepared a trick for me, a stunt which involved each of them using their hands to contort the face of the other. One sister pulled the other's eyelids down, while the second sister stretched the first one's lips taut. I laughed, causing Clayton to turn to see what was happening. The girls clawed at each other's faces again, but this time, the first one did not stop at pulling down her sister's eyelids. She tore her eyelids off, then wriggled her fingers into the corners of her eyes. While her eyes were being gouged, the second sister was tearing at the first one's lips until they split apart. They giggled as they mangled one another. "No, stop that!" I shouted, reaching over the table, pushing it into Clayton's chest by accident. I reached for the girls. Their parents both rose to intervene. I thought they were going to separate the girls, but they targeted me. The father caught one of my wrists and shoved me backward hard. "Back off," he shouted, as the mother ushered her perfectly uninjured daughters away. The father hovered until they were safe, then said, "What kind of creeps are you, huh? Why don't you play with each other instead of little girls?" I don't think it came out quite the way he intended. He glared awkwardly, then followed his family out of the cafe. I tried to ask Clayton if he had seen the girls ripping at each other, but first the new barista said, "Hey, you two, I don't know what you did, but get out and leave your food. I know you didn't pay for it." We obeyed without argument. Clayton had barely touched his panini. With our mission's earnings, we had just enough to rent a motel room that night. Ordinarily, we would have saved the cash and slept in the car, but that night, we both needed a good, safe rest. On the way there, I finally asked Clayton if he had seen the girls' violent behavior, but he insisted they had only made goofy faces at me. But then he asked something strange. "What was with the dad's tongue? Did you see that?" I tried but recalled nothing remarkable about the father's appearance. Clayton said, "You didn't notice it was forked and almost black? I think he might have had it tattooed or something." "I didn't notice at all," I replied, thinking I certainly would have, if it had been real. We took turns in the shower, Clayton going first. I could barely wait to clean the muck off. It smelled so rank I couldn't believe we had been allowed to sit in the cafe as long as we had. For a long time I let the hot water pour over me and breathed in the steam. After a while, I opened my eyes and looked down. The water flowing into the drain still looked gray, but the murky color was not flowing down towards the drain. It was crawling up through the tiny rivulets running from my toes. Some of the gray had already reached my foot. It snaked over my toes, up my feet, and around my ankles. I pointed the shower head directly at my feet to wash it away, but the infection continued climbing up to my knees, giving my lower legs the appearance of a stone statue. I leapt through the curtain and almost slipped on the tile outside. When I looked down, steadying myself, my feet were only discolored by the sustained heat they suffered. No trace of the gray stuff marked my skin, only reddish pink. I pulled back the shower curtain and shut off the tap. Every drop on the ground, the wall, the curtain looked clear. Wrapping a towel around my waist, I brushed my teeth. The vibration of my electric toothbrush awakened a pain deep in my right ear. It passed in a moment, and I resumed brushing. The pain repeated, this time pushing outward from my internal ear toward the canal. I dropped my toothbrush and pressed both hands against the side of my head in a vain attempt to suppress the ache. Something brushed against my right thumb. I flicked at it, then tilted my head toward the mirror to see if anything was there. My reflection appeared normal. The pain began to dissipate. I wrote it off as psychosomatic. "Devon, you good in there?" Clayton called through the door. I must have made some sound in my distress. I said, "Yeah, I think so." I think that forest just messed with my head. Tell me about it, he said as he walked away. I heard the TV come on. My eyes flicked back to my reflection. This time, I saw what had touched me. The tip of a bright red worm had emerged from my ear canal and now stretched at least an inch out of my ear. Gagging, I grabbed the wriggling creature and tugged firmly but slowly so as not to damage the inner workings of my ear. I felt the worm try to slither back into me, but I won. The battle, at least. The last thing I heard before the ringing which would fill my next 2 hours was a waxy squelch as I finally removed the awful thing. I tossed the worm on the floor, kicked my dirty clothes onto it, and stomped. I felt its jelly body pop under my heel, but in cadence with that satisfying feeling came a stampede in my head. A stampede of snakes. I felt my brain writhing, worming, every noodle of gray matter crawling over the others. And it hurt. Clayton said something behind the door. I don't know what. I didn't care. I just wanted the pain to end. I think I wanted to die. I saw my toothbrush lying in the sink. An intrusive idea occurred upon my seeing it. If I could get the toothbrush far enough up my nose, I could scrub the worms off my brain. A ridiculous plan, I know, but I existed in the darkest corners of ridiculousness by then. Apparently, I had locked the door at some point because Clayton couldn't get in. As I picked up my toothbrush, I was vaguely aware of him turning at the knob. I pushed the toothbrush in, bristles up. The worms were almost to my nose already. I could smell their swampy stench, but I had a cure now. I turned the toothbrush on. The door burst open and Clayton stepped in. The lock gave out to his desperate grip. He stopped when I turned toward him with my toothbrush halfway up my nose. Our eyes met, and the worms went still. My sinuses burned, but that was due to the toothpaste. Ow! I couldn't help yelling as I pulled the toothbrush from my nostril. What were you trying to do? And why didn't you answer me? Clayton demanded. Checking my orifices in the mirror, I said, There's worms in my head. I could feel them just a second ago, but now it's like they're gone. Clayton said, Hey, you know what? I've been having these weird sorts of hallucinations too. Maybe there is some kind of gas out in those woods. No, I said, breaking away from the mirror. Look, I pulled one out of my ear. I picked up my dirty clothes. I half expected the worm to be missing, but there it was. Clayton gagged. Are you saying that came out of you? I didn't answer. Instead, I stooped to examine the disgusting parasite I'd murdered. It must have been 5 inches long originally. I'd smushed an extra inch into it. The worm itself was transparent. The red color I'd seen while removing it stemmed from a bright red vein running its length. There's more of these in my head. I could feel them, I said. Clayton replied, You were probably just grossed out by that worm. I bet it was stuck in your hair or something. No, Clayton, I had to pull it out of my ear. It tried to fight its way back in. Okay, so what do you want to do? Go see a doctor? You know neither of us can afford that. We could see a priest for free, I said. What? Why? Because of what happened at the cafe, and this, I said, pointing at the worm with my toe. I think something in those woods is affecting us, and before we go broke on any doctors, I want to make sure this isn't a spiritual problem. But you've never been religious, Clayton said. No, but the Catholics are guarding the woods, and they're always the ones dealing with demons and whatever in the movies. I don't know, it just seems like the logical choice to me. All right, fine, Clayton sighed. We'll go in the morning. I hope we don't burst into flames walking through the front doors of a church, though. Yeah, I answered. Me too. St. John's high steeple could be seen from our motel window. Clayton and I walked to it the next morning. On the sidewalk, I felt fine, but the moment I stepped onto the church's front walkway, the worms came alive again. At the first tickling sensation, I jerked hard to the left and ran into Clayton. My head filled with throbbing pain and disgusting sensations, and I started to fall. Clayton guided me to the ground and called out for help. A priest suddenly appeared above me. He stooped with Clayton to examine me. "The worms!" I screamed. I felt one creeping into the back of my throat and closed my mouth. "He thinks there's worms in his head," Clayton translated. The priest looked from him to me, then stretched a hand toward me. When it was an inch from my forehead, the worms doubled their frantic activity, but the moment his fingers touched me, the worms stopped. I could still feel them pressing against my skull, but they were paralyzed. The priest almost pulled his hand away after a couple of seconds, but I grabbed it and held it to my forehead. "That's helping somehow," I said. In a halfway attempt to whisper, the priest told Clayton, "He may need a hospital. Did he take something?" "No, he doesn't do drugs," Clayton answered. The priest said, "It's okay. He won't get in any trouble. I just want to get him help." "We went in the forest," I croaked. When I spoke, I could feel that one worm dangling like an extra uvula. A bus passed by, and I saw the priest wince in frustration. He had been waiting for that bus at the corner. Clayton explained, "He's saying we went into the forest you guys, the church, owns. Diablo or something?" "Diaboli Forest?" the priest rhetorically asked. I chose this moment to reach into my throat and pinch the worm hanging there. The priest's eyes widened as I dragged it out of my mouth. When I held it up to show him, he backed away. "Stay here," he ordered. Standing, he hurried up the walkway and through the church's front door. Slowly, the worms started moving again. Fortunately, the priest was only gone for a couple of minutes. He returned with a small crucifix and a flask. "What are you going to do, an exorcism?" asked Clayton. The priest said, No, not quite. I don't think we've come to that point yet." "Yet?" I asked. The priest looked at both of us disappointedly. "Those woods are guarded for a reason. There's a legitimate evil out there. It's one of many places the church protects to keep the forces of hell at bay." Clayton started to say, "Come on, that's..." But the priest held up the crucifix and said, "Let's just see." He placed the cross on my forehead, and again the worms froze. He asked, "Better?" "So much," I said. Clayton rolled his eyes. "All right, can you keep your eyes open?" he asked, fidgeting with the flask. "Wait, what are you going to do to his eyes?" Clayton demanded. "It's holy water." "Into his eyes?" My eyes dried out as I waited, but I held them open for whatever sweet relief the priest had in store next. "Relax," he said. "It's distilled." He poured 3 drops into each of my eyes. I felt them run into the corners and be absorbed there. All the pressure in my head moved to my inner ears. I clenched my eyes and mouth shut. "Please try to stay relaxed," the priest said. "The evil's working its way out." "How?" Clayton asked, worried. His answer came a moment later, as worms, dozens, crawled out of both my ears, my nose, and my mouth. I rolled over onto all fours and coughed them out. The priest held the crucifix to the back of my head. It felt like the worms were fleeing from it. Clayton stood behind us, yelling at the priest to please call an ambulance, but the priest insisted everything would be okay. I gave Clayton a thumbs up to soothe him. Soon a pile of worms lay beneath me, and they finally stopped coming. "Thank you," I said, then spat to get some of the worm taste out of my mouth. "You're not done yet," said the priest. You have to take this manifestation back to the forest. Out here, its evil's just going to spread." "I thought the forest was too dangerous for us," Clayton said. "Well," answered the priest, "you chose this, not me." More was said, but nothing as notable as the instructions already mentioned. The priest retrieved a plastic bag for us to transport the worms in and sent us on our way back to DIABOLI Forest. "You doing okay?" I asked Clayton. He'd volunteered to drive, having just witnessed half a pound of parasites wriggle out of my brain. His color looked wrong. I figured I knew why, but wanted to check. He answered, "Just a little queasy, I guess. Probably just anxiety." I thought he might be right. When DIABOLI Forest rose on the horizon, his color changed again, for the worse. His skin looked nearly as translucent as the worms bagged up between my feet. "Let's be quick," I said, when he finally stopped the car. We made no attempt to hide it this time, since we were basically on assignment from the church itself. If any security patrols wanted to take over for us, they could be our guests. Clayton followed me to the edge of the trees. His appearance began to frighten me. He stepped in lazy lurches, and he'd started sweating well beyond what was appropriate for the comfortable weather. I needed to get him back. Holding my breath, I unsealed the bag, held it over the fence, and dumped out the worms. Clayton groaned, "Dev," before slumping to the ground. I hurried to his limp body. Clayton, come on, wake up. You're okay. Just wake up. I'm going to take you back right now. It's over, Clayton. It's over." My cries did nothing to wake him. His color faded even further. My fingers searched for a pulse and found none. Again, I shouted for him to wake up. Tears welled in my eyes. Suddenly, in my arms, Clayton spasmed. His body went rigid. His fingers locked in extreme backward extension. Was it a seizure? I only knew one thing about seizures, and that was to put something in the victim's mouth to keep them from choking on their tongue. Clayton's jaw was already locked open like his hands. A threatening groan croaked out of his throat. I let him slide to the ground and bent over him, checking his tongue. 2 tears fell from my eyes in unison. Both fell into Clayton's gaping mouth. They rolled down his tongue and disappeared. His eyes snapped open. The pupils dilated to needle points. The whites looked yellow and bloodshot. In those eyes, I saw something that was not Clayton. Suddenly, he gagged, then choked. He rolled over onto his stomach, clutching it in obvious agony, then rolled back. An awful, slimy squelch emitted from his mouth, and I stepped back, afraid. Worms gushed out of him, splattering his clothes and the dirt surrounding him. Traces of holy water must have been left in my tear ducts, lucky for me, lucky for both of us. When the upheaval of his guts finished, Clayton collapsed. I shouted and ran to him. The worms wriggled all around us, seeking a host. "Now it's over," he whispered. His eyes opened, and I saw him in them again. It took me a few seconds to trust him, but as soon as I did, I helped him to his feet. He tore off his shirt and threw it into the woods. "Eat that," he spat. I tried to let him have the moment, but couldn't stifle my laugh for long. He joined in, saying, "Sounded better in my head." Clayton was wrong about one thing. Our ordeal was not over. We both saw, at the same time, a swarm of black dots racing through the sky. The dots grew larger as they approached. They grew wings. "Are those birds?" Clayton asked. "Hey," I replied. "I think we should run." We sprinted to the car as the swarm descended on the worms. This time, I jumped into the driver's seat. Hundreds of wrens, like the one which had been thrown at us in the forest, feasted upon the rejected worms. Some landed over the fence and feasted on mine. Then, one by one, they turned toward us. "Go," Clayton shouted, but I had already put the car in reverse. Our tires kicked dust and rocks into the air. The birds also took flight. I drove backward until I could no longer safely reverse. As I jammed the car into drive, the swarm of birds sped toward us. The first splattered against the windshield before I turned the car around. The second hit Clayton's side. They rained down on us until I hit 50 miles per hour, and even then a few reached us, splattering on the rear window. I watched the rest in the rearview mirror. They all took dives at the car. Most missed and ended up flat on the road. Hundreds of birds, possessed by a terrible evil, lay dead behind us. "Where are we supposed to go?" Clayton asked, long after we were clear of the birds, DIABOLI Forrest, and Plattsburgh. My hands had only just stopped shaking. I turned to him and answered with only one word, the most delicious word I have ever uttered. Home. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. You will get a new story every week if you do. If you feel ready, meet me here next week for another journey into the Warning Woods. Thank you for listening.